So Shela Sheikh is a lecturer in the Department of Media, Communication and Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths University of London, where she convenes the MA in Postcolonial Culture and Global Policy, and she also co-chairs the Goldsmiths Critical Ecologies Research stream. She was also a research fellow in the project Forensic Architecture, also at Goldsmiths, and she was part of a recent multi-platform research project around colonialism, botany, and the politics of planting, which, among other things, included the publication of a special issue of Third Text, co-edited with Ross Gray, called The Wretched Earth, Botanical Conflicts and Artistic Interventions. So Shela's current research interrogates various forms of witnessing between the human, technological, and the environmental. As part of this, she's working on a monograph about more than human witnessing collectivities in the context of race, nature, and environmental politics. So please give a warm welcome to Shela Sheikh.
That is still a sort of kind of critical mass with us on a Sunday afternoon. Also Christopher for the ad hoc moderation, that's very kind. In terms of what I'm going to talk about today, in terms of the title, can you hear me? Yes. Yeah? Okay. In terms of the really beautiful, evocative title of the biennial, Light Writing, I'm going to be talking about nature and representation and a sort of expanded sense of imaging that includes the photographic. So in a sense, I'm talking about light writing in relation to the light writing of photography in relation to earth writing. So of course we can think about geographies, the geography, the writing of the earth. So I'm going to be thinking about the way in which we can talk about light writing and the writing of the earth together. Also, I think there's some quite nice resonances with the first panel of this morning. I'm just going to start the timer. So I know. In terms of questions of representation and subalternities, so hopefully there'll be a quite nice layering of those issues, which I really appreciated this morning. So I'm going to begin with the premise that in our contemporary moment of ever-exacerbated anthropocenic environmental violence, and by anthropocenic I'm referencing the Anthropocene that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, this current sort of epoch or era in which man is recognized scientifically to be as a geological agent who's bringing about the destruction of the planet. So in this current anthropocenic era or moment, my claim is that traditionally accepted schemas of witnessing and bearing witness require reconfiguring. So we've already heard about witnessing in terms of memory and politics and agency and sort of subaltern history, so I'm going to try and add a sort of different element to witnessing. So advances in non-human rights and the rights of nature, then many have led to the entry of non-human forms of life into legal and political spheres. Something that's been witnessed notably in India, for instance with the ruling in March 2017 that the river Ganga and the river Yamuna are quote-unquote legal persons. So this, i.e. this recognition of nature or the inherent rights of nature is important in moving away from legal systems and of course social and cultural systems that treat nature as property, so something to be an object to be extracted and profited from. Other notable examples are the inclusion of the rights of nature into the Bolivian and Ecuadorian constitutions in 2008 and 2009, but this is something that's happening in many different countries around the world. But beyond being the bearer of rights or a legal person, my question is whether nature can be understood as a witness. So this presentation forms part of a broader project that argues for the necessity of what I call more than human, and many others use this term more than human. So more than human meaning the human and the non-human in a constellation. So what I call more than human witnessing collectivities that bear witness to historical and contemporary violations against humans and non-humans, and that propose alternative forms of sociality and resilience that might allow for more livable futures. So to give some context, the backdrop against which I speak is that that of neo-colonial environmental violence that's enacted globally both against racialized human bodies and against nature. And with this, the entanglement between abuses of human and non-human rights. So thinking the way in which the violations against the human often take place through violations against the non-human. So for a start, violations of human rights have been and continue to be often carried out through the environment. For instance, through scorched earth tactics, environmental remodeling, planting, the creation of enclosures, and dispossession through land grabbing. There are many countless examples of that here in India. So moreover, in the context of environmental racism, such violations are often enacted against racialized populations who are culturally and politically rendered disposable or sacrificable. So for instance, we can think of climate refugees, or those denied access to potable water, those who are exposed to higher levels of pollution and or toxicity, or those who are removed from their land in the name of the profitability of extractive capitalism. Or, in a more sinister vein, those who are removed from their land in the name of conservation. And I'm mentioning race and racialization. It's not something I'll talk about when I come to talk about the two artistic projects that I'll focus on, but I think it's important to signal that when we're talking about race, about nature, we're also talking about all forms of categories in terms of gender and race and sort of categorization of the human. So what I'm interested in is the political silence of creatures and landforms that we call, quote-unquote, nature. And I have to just say that whenever I use the word nature, there are sort of invisible quotation marks because it's impossible to speak of one unified thing that is nature. So I'm using that term for shorthand. So I'm talking about the political silence of creatures and landforms that we call nature, whereby nature is treated as an object, a resource without rights and without voice. So moreover, when nature is treated as an object that needs to be protected by humans, but only, importantly, by certain kinds of humans. So the question of who is entitled to or who ought to speak in the name of whom is one of my key concerns. Above all, in the context of the silencing and the constructed categories active and passive, or subject and object, as these play out across race, nature, and shifting conceptions of the human. So often, as anthropologist Leslie Green writes, and she's writing about the South African context, but this applies to many others, who has the right to advocate for nature is profoundly racialized. Quote, since voices raised in the protection of nature have an uneasy time escaping the scripts of race and racism. End quote. So key here is the subject-object relation that must be read through the legacy of colonial categorizations of forms of life, in which the violence that is racism functions through the classification of some humans as subjects, those who have the right to speak, the right to have rights, as Hannah Arendt would famously say, and others who are silent, reduced to objects or things in a racial imaginary in which some people are reduced to closer to the non-human. So in which some people are classed as a lesser species, let's say. In other words, in which some people are classed as closer to nature. This is sort of problematic around the idea of the native being close to nature. So, jumping to the figure of the witness, over the past few years I've been struck by appearance of terms referring to non-human entities, natural entities, as witnesses in the context of artworks. So for a start, many visual and literary works mobilize the idea of landscape or nature, specifically the earth, as an archive. So such works speak, for instance, of the earthly memory, or of soil as a natural and an independent and historical body, foregrounding the artist/historian/investigator's task of mining the surface, uprooting stories, and bringing back the sediments of the past.
So further work suggests natural life forms, for instance seeds, and this is something I've written about, as migration silent witnesses, so being able to trace the movement of bodies and goods through the movement of certain species of plants, particularly in ships. So but beyond what I believe to be the poetic generativity of such terms in the realm of metaphor, my question is, what does it mean to speak of nature itself as witness? Can we speak in literal terms here? So can nature be a witness? So in brief, one of my main points is that where what is demanded is collective action, the witness can no longer be a solitary figure. Rather, the witness must instead be but one within a collective, or collectivity. So moreover, it's precisely in the context of a collectivity that the witness figure is produced, inscribed within a particular social milieu, or an ecological milieu, what we can call a relational testimonial constellation. So in this context, I argue that although the figure of the witness has traditionally been confined to the human, where what is at stake is care for both human and non-human life, witness collectivities need necessarily entail an expansion beyond the category of the human. So just as a caveat, to be clear, I'm not proposing that nature itself be conceived as a witness figure, strictly speaking. So I'm not saying that a tree as a single form of life or natural life can be considered as this, what was traditionally defined as a human figure, because that in itself would entail a form of anthropomorphism or a sort of a granting of human qualities to nature, or a sort of assumption that nature can bear witness linguistically in the way that human figures do. Rather, my claim is, or my argument is, that witnesses are produced in the context of more than human socialities, between the human and the non-human. So I'm saying we need to maintain the figure of the human witness, but expand that to think about the human in relation to other forms of life, and think about the testimony that's produced between different forms of life. So I'm by no means the first to propose that the figure of the witness be extended beyond the human. So in the legal context, as I already mentioned, practices and theorizations of non-human rights or the rights of nature, and with this shifting categories of personhood, legal standing, and quote-unquote voice, have done much to make nature inhabit the courtrooms of national and transnational forums as potential witnesses of legal violations. And there are also other examples, other notable examples. So for instance, the work of Susan Schuppli, who I'm going to come back to. This paper's in, I forgot to say, it's two parts. I'm doing the general context, and then I'm going to look at two photographic practices. So the work of Susan Schuppli, who since 2005, both through her art practice and her theoretical writing, has been developing the concept of, or what she would call a kind of operative concept of the material witness. So an operative concept that foregrounds what she calls the expressive quality of non-human matter, and demonstrates how media artifacts and environmental conditions themselves bear witness not only to events, so not only historical events, but also they bear witness to the processes of sorting and registration that are imposed upon them in order for them to qualify as evidence in the first place. Asking how objects and environments are made to speak as technical witnesses to crimes. So one work is, for instance, this evidence on trial. There's a whole series through the sort of umbrella term, material witness. This is where she's looking at the archives of the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and looking at how different technologies and different media forms themselves can bear witness to the way in which they've moved through legal contexts and the way in which they're sorted and handled. So they're not simply bearing witness to, or they're not simply functioning as evidence of events that they're representing, but they're functioning as evidence of the sort of milieu in which they're circulating. Schuppli's work was formative for another important reference, which has already been mentioned, and that's the forensic aesthetics upon which the work of the Goldsmiths-based Forensic Architecture Agency is based. And this is an agency, a project that arose in the context of the fallibility of human testimony. So this idea that especially after the Eichmann trial in 1961, there was a lot of work that was developing the way in which, through sort of lacunae in memory and through trauma, the human witness figure is inherently unreliable. This, on the one hand, is the strength of testimony, but it's also its downfall, which means that testimony needs to work hand in hand with evidence. So it's in that context that forensic architecture arose. So in the absence of reliable human witnesses, and this is often because there are no survivors to violations and crimes, forensic aesthetics turns instead to the agency of matter, be this organic or inorganic, including natural environments, or to object witnesses, as they name them, to question factual reality as expressed by the state. And this is something sort of continuing with the discussion yesterday of the way in which certain technologies can be reappropriated and used against the state. This is very much what they're doing. When I speak of forensic aesthetics, it's just important to note that the term aesthetics here is being used in terms of sensing practices. So it's not simply like aesthetic beauty and sort of the pictorial and so on and so forth. It's the idea of matter having traces inscribed into it. So the aesthetic is sensing. So as mentioned, in conceiving of nature as witness, we run the risk of anthropocentrism, and well-intentioned gestures of advocacy, of speaking for or giving voice, knowingly or inadvertently entail the possibility of silencing. So as the feminist scholar of environmental humanities Astrida Naimanis writes, the warnings posed by Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak in her seminal 1988 essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, prove as prescient as ever, albeit in this context relating to a different form of subaltern. So in this case, we now see the dangers of speaking for and misrepresenting not only the human, often indigenous subaltern, but also nature. So thinking of nature as subaltern. So as Spivak had famously asserted, attempts to represent the subaltern are often predicated upon what she calls an epistemic violence that constitutes the colonial subject as other. So Spivak points to the blindness of French post-structuralist thinking regarding the implications of imperialism in this epistemic violence. So in short, as Spivak tells us, the subaltern cannot speak, this has everything to do with their addressee or their spokesperson, their viewer, let's say, not being able to hear. So in Spivak's words, it's important to acknowledge Western and post-colonial academics' complicity in the muting of the subject, of the subaltern. As anthropologist Rosalind Morris writes, the corollary question to that of whether the subaltern can speak, i.e. how can we learn to listen, remains radically open. And in the context of the photographic works that I'll be turning to, my question would be, well, how can we learn to read? So in Naimanis' reading, things are pushed to the extreme, and the conundrum remains as to whether any form of representation, however well-intentioned, necessarily involves at least some form of silencing or some form of colonization. It's a pretty extreme claim, but you can see how it works structurally at least. A rendering passive or mute, a silencing. So representation, especially in the defense of the rights of nature, remains what she calls an impossible necessity, an experience of being trapped between what she calls the representationless rock and a hard place of complicit silence. But practically speaking, there are various manners through which we might think this paradox, or this impossible necessity of representing non-humans. So to be clear, Spivak does not suggest that we do away with representation. And in the context of environmental violence, this is also most definitely not an option. So I'm not suggesting that nature be retrieved and ushered into the category of the subject. Rather, that we remain attentive to the possible mechanisms of silencing that take place between the two senses of representation that Spivak talks about in her essay. So she's talking about representation as aesthetic representation and then also as political representation in terms of the proxy. But despite all of this, we need to remain attentive to the fact that nature does, in fact, represent itself. So for a start, we know that vegetal life has highly complex means of communication, as has been studied through the fields of plant intelligence, biosemiotics, and bioacoustics, for a start. So Naimana speaks of nature's capacity to right itself. So she looks to ice and water's capacity to materially register traces, and as such to destabilize any rigid boundary between nature and culture. So one is passive, inert matter that's there to be consumed and to be rendered transparent. The other is the consumer, or the renderer. So in what remains of this presentation, part 2, I'll be looking at 2 examples of artistic practices in which nature is shown to represent itself. Or rather, 2 practices in which we can see the aesthetics of the earth. So the first being what I'm calling earth images, falling within the conventional confines of photography, is a series that's titled Desert Bloom by the photographer Shela Sheikh. Some of you in India might know some work that he did in India, Moksha and Vladley, but I won't take time to speak about those. So anyway, Desert Bloom, this is just a composite of some of the images. And I'll go through a few just to give you a bit more of a sense of what's happening in the images. So this is the middle section of a trilogy that he produced between 2010 and 2013, entitled the Eurasia Trilogy, which traces the legacy of the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 and its lasting impact on the Palestinians, the Bedouins, and the Israelis of the region. This was published in 2015 by Steyr. I think because I'm a little bit behind, I won't talk about the other 2 elements of the trilogy. I'm just going to jump straight through to Desert Bloom. So in Desert Bloom, Sheikh turns to the lasting legacy of the Bedouin Nakba, as it's been called, beginning in 1948 and continuing through to 1953. So this is in the Nakab, or the Negev desert. So the period says between 1948 and 1953, during which the Israeli military violently expelled an estimated 90% of the 100,000 Bedouin inhabitants of the Negev desert, and expelled them into the West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, and Egypt, in the process erasing the traces of their settlements and their presence on the land. This is vital, the erasure of traces, the erasure of historical claims to the inhabiting the land. So in Desert Bloom, Sheikh explores the matter in which the Zionist dream of making the desert bloom, settling in the Negev. This is encapsulated in Ben-Gurion's invocation to make the desert bloom, has transformed the desert. So here you can actually see preparation for planting of forests. This is another thing you can see here as well. So cleaning out spaces for trees to be planted. So reading the land through these series of aerial images, we witness how decades of irrigation and afforestation have gone hand in hand with urbanization, militarization, mining, construction, contamination, and destruction, as well as the continued displacement of the Bedouins. So here, through this aerial vantage point, Sheikh's images make eerily visible the manners in which the rhetoric of conservation, environmentalism, cultivation, and commemoration, in fact, serves as a smokescreen for continued racism, expulsion, and dispossession. And these are just some examples. So this is evaporation ponds for a phosphate mine. These are storage facilities for ammunition, because the desert is used because it's seen as kind of empty space and nobody's living there, so it's used for military preparations, military training. So you have like simulations of live fire training zones, for instance. This is a Bedouin settlement, so I'll come back to this in a bit, this idea of trying to sort of forensically find evidence for the settlement of the desert by the Bedouins. I'll skip on a bit. So also just to note that the images are accompanied by extensive research, historical documents, oral testimonies. So it's not like the images are functioning simply on their own as an evidentiary sort of material. But what I'm particularly interested in here in terms of the sort of context of this presentation and the discussion of representation is the way in which, as these aerial images show, the surface of the Earth itself comes to take on a photographic quality, i.e. it comes to take on the sort of aesthetic sense of representation that I already mentioned. So as A.R. Weisman, the principal investigator of forensic architecture, has written of this work, and he's written a publication called The Conflict Shoreline, in which he gives a reading of these images, sort of supplements them with historical aerial images, and then sort of requests to provide legal evidence to support claims by the Bedouins. But as he writes, and I'll quote him at length, for those willing and able to read photographs closely, the surface of the desert at this time can reveal not only what is present, but also the subtle traces of what has been erased. So traces of ruined houses, small agricultural installations, to fields that are no longer, watering holes, and the stains of long-removed livestock pens. So you can actually see in here, there are these round spaces are the stains of livestock pens. So in these images, and I'm still quoting Weisman, the surface of the Earth appears as if it was itself a photograph, exposed to direct and indirect contact, physical use, and climatic conditions in a similar way in which a film is exposed to the sun's rays. Sheikh's aerial images must therefore be studied as photographs of photographs. And I'll just continue a bit, because I think it's important what he says later on. He says, just like a film, the surface of the Earth is a recording device. Just like the terrain, the image has a distinct material topography. Photographs are not an unmediated copy of the world. They are a relation between material objects. So one of celluloid, and this is the historical aerial images that he's talking about, one of celluloid, plastic coated with gelatin emulsion containing silver halide crystals, and the other of stone, earth, and vegetation. And these are mediated by the climate between them. So just moving on to the next series, this is called Slick Images. This is by Susan Shuppi, who I already mentioned. As Shuppi's work shows, in particular in this series, Slick Images, and also another series that's called Nature Represents Itself, environments themselves are expressive. And I'll come to her images, but I'll just give some context of other images. So polluted environments, for instance, contain vast photosensitive surfaces that register and record the changes caused by modern industrialization. So this can be mobilized by the practice of forensics, this is the practice of forensic architecture, in which such traces are read and narrated by the expert or the non-expert witness in the quest for accountability and exposure. So these images are part of the series that she's also sort of using the broader umbrella term Earth Evidence, which investigates how environmental systems operate as vast information networks composed of technical as well as natural sensors that are registering and transmitting the signals of pollution and climate change. So here, as Shuppi puts it, terrestrial, aquatic, and atmospheric environments function as complex forms of technical media that are directly engaged in recording external events, which they express as material transformations and molecular rearrangements. So in this series, this is a sort of media image of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010 that I'm sure many of you are familiar with from media reports. And this is an image that was taken by the US Coast Guard. Then we have satellite imagery of the event, so you can see the oil slick, and this is a NASA image. Then you have also underwater imagery. This is the oil, the video feeds of their attempts to somehow stop the oil spill. And again, more satellite imagery. And then I'll come to Shuppi's work. So basically what she's done is she's made a film that's a kind of rendering or a sort of simulation of the surface of the water and the way in which the oil is interacting with the surface of the water, with the claim being that actually the surface of the water it has a capacity to represent itself and to sort of bear the traces of what's happening to it in terms of its kind of pollution. So what she's arguing here is that the artworks, through her artworks and through the accompanying exhibition material, is that the oil slick itself, so beyond the external images, so the water itself and the oil slick, beyond these kind of external images, she's talking about the slick itself becoming or operationalizing what she's calling an independent mode of cinema as what she names a slick image. So for Shukri, the cinematic capacity of the oil spill is a feature of its very ontology, its molecular structure and behavior. So in a sense, you can see how the mixture here of the oil and the water is becoming a kind of technical media. It's taking on a cinematic capacity. So as such, the oil slick can be understood as engaged in what she said and calls the production of a new form of cinema that's organized by the found footage of nature itself. The conditions that brought about the disaster are thus re-expressed as an ontological rearrangement of molecular matter. So a shift, and I'm quoting her here, a shift from the representation. I'll finish. Yeah. A shift from the representation of damaged drilling rig and its gushing cruise to the actualization of a ruinous image. And I'll just quote one more sentence from her and then try to wrap it up in my 1 minute. So in essence, she's saying, I propose an inquiry that takes seriously the idea of nature, that nature is fully capable of documenting its own damaged condition and thus representing itself. So what I would have done in the conclusion is spoken about how this capacity of nature to represent itself, that in itself isn't enough. So this needs to be sort of placed in the context of other forms. So you can have human witnessing, human testimony as well. You can have other forms of evidence. You can have kind of more performative forums, tribunals, theatrical trials, so on and so forth. So this sort of representation as evidence needs to be placed into a forum and narrated. And I would have spoken about a few examples, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.